One night, a cop was driving home from work. He had had a pretty rough day. He was just looking forward to getting home and relaxing. And so he was driving down the road, and all of a sudden, around this bend comes this car careening almost into his lane. At the last second, the driver jerked the wheel and missed his cop car, but at the same moment, he yelled out the window, "Pig!" Well, that irritated the cop. He did not like being called a pig, and even though he was off duty, he was going to get this. He knew the guy was speeding and reckless driving, and so he decided that he would turn around and chase after that guy. And so he continues down the road and starts to brake to find a place to turn around, and goes around the bend and runs smack into a pig in the middle of the road. And so I wonder if you have ever heard something and assumed that somebody meant one thing when really that was not the case at all. I think we've all done that, haven't we? Assume something that was not reality. Mary and Joseph did some incorrect assuming as well. I mean, we assume different things all the time. We assume people are a certain way because of the way they dress or look. We assume good things about them. We assume that assume bad things about someone because the way they're dressed or that they look. Come to find out later that that's not the case at all. We sometimes assume that because there was a mistake made or something didn't go the way that we thought that it should go, that we know why it got messed up. And so we assume that we know why, and we don't want to hear the reason of why it went wrong. And so we're in this first part of the scripture, we witness Mary and Joseph assuming something, that Jesus was with their traveling band of family and friends, right? They had been to Jerusalem to celebrate the Passover, and they were traveling back home. And so they went a day's journey before they realized that their assumption was wrong, that Jesus was actually not with them. Now, Jesus was 12, and in the Jewish tradition, 13 is the age of accountability where you become an adult. And if you're a boy, you have a bar mitzvah. If you're a girl, you have a bat mitzvah. And you become an adult at that time. Now, in this time, when there were groups like this that were traveling back and forth, it was very common for the men to travel together in one group and the women and children to travel in another group. So it could have been something like Joseph assumed that Jesus was traveling with Mary and his siblings. And Mary could have assumed that Jesus, because he was on the cusp of that adulthood age, was traveling for the first time in the group of men. But we know that neither one of them was correct, right? And so they start to look for him, and they realize that he's not with him, and so they turn around, they go back to Jerusalem. They don't find him until the next day, which means they were probably looking in places where he wasn't. And so they do find him in the temple. But it made me think about the kind of assumptions that all of us walk around with. What are some things that you assume in your life that you're not quite sure, or when you think about it, you don't know if you've really had the explanation? Maybe you assume that you're not good enough for whatever, your job, your life. Maybe you assume that you're too good for your station in life. Maybe you assume that you're not making a difference in anything that you're doing. Or maybe you assume that you haven't been given your due. What are the kind of assumptions that we walk around with? I know I had a friend who wanted to apply for a job, but she said, I'm just assuming that I'm not qualified because I don't have every single thing on their list. And I said, you should apply anyway, because you are a hard worker and a quick learner, and you have enough experience in the working world that you would be great at that job. And she applied, and she got the job. So how often do we assume things and don't have an experience because we just assume that we're not good enough or it's not a fit for us? And then what kind of assumptions do we have about God or our relationship with God? I mean, there are some good assumptions. I hope you assume that God is always with you. That is certainly true. That's a good assumption to believe in and to carry. But do you assume other things as well? Like sometimes you kind of get into a place in your life where you assume like prayer doesn't really help anything, or you assume like it doesn't matter whether or not you come to church, or it doesn't matter whether I call that person that's on my mind. They don't really know me anyway, and it won't do any good. What are some assumptions that you are living with, walking around with, that are holding you back from experiencing a fuller life with God and with Christ? The sermon is in 3 parts today. So we come to the end of this first part, and at the end of each part, we are going to have a time of reflection. And so in this time of reflection, I want you to think about your assumptions that you walk around with. That might be assumption about a person, it might be assumption about a situation or an event. And I want you to ask yourself, do I really know that my assumptions are correct? And is there something that I need to dig deeper into to figure that out so I can live a more full life? And think about what your assumptions are about God and your faith. Are you doing all that you can to draw closer to God? Or do you need to dig deeper? Think about that in these moments of reflection. Jesus. They found Jesus in the temple. And public teaching in a temple was customary at this time, especially during high holy days, Feast of Passover. And the traditional Jewish method of teaching was kind of a response, a dialogue between teacher and students, so that it appreciated all teachers as students and all students as teachers. And so for Jesus to be asking and even answering questions was not out of the ordinary, but he was a very good student. Certainly it's said that they were impressed with his sharpness, and he was asking questions full of wisdom. But I think this little chunk of scripture also, we see a contrast in Jesus. We see a contrast of the divine and the human in Jesus. Jesus is certainly gifted in his religious studies, and he's feeling the call to work on his relationship with God being in the temple. But we catch a glimpse of his humanity when Mary and Joseph finally find Jesus in the temple. They say, "Oh my gosh, where have you been? We have been worried sick." And his response sounds very much like a 12-year-old to me. I don't know if you caught that or not. But they say, "Where were you?" And he looks at them like, "What are you so upset about?" I mean, obviously, I'm in the temple. Not really a response that sounds respectful to his mom and dad. Not, "I'm sorry, Mom and Dad, I should have told you where I was going or what I was doing." No, Mary scolds him, and he scolds her right back, thinking they would know and they would understand, except they don't, do they? At this point, they don't understand why Jesus is there in the temple. So we have the contrast of this 12-year-old who's really wise for his age, but is still growing up emotionally. And I think we can all understand that, can't we? That in some situations in our lives, we handle them better than others. I would say about myself that I'm okay at handling difficult situations. I can assess the situation, figure out what needs to be done, make a plan, follow it through. But then put me in a left turn only lane with a green arrow, and I miss the arrow by 1 car, and I start to lose it. Like my life is going to end, right? We all have times in our lives where we act like a spiritually mature believer and a 12-year-old. And that's just who we are, and that's what we catch a glimpse of in this scripture. So this time, as you have a quiet reflection time, think about the contrasting parts of you. When are you spiritually mature? And when do you act like a 12-year-old? And ask God if he can help you in the coming days and in the new year to maybe balance that out a little, so that in more situations we lean more toward acting out of love and our spiritual maturity than our 12-year-oldness. In the last segment of the story, it tells us that Jesus returned to Nazareth with his mom and dad and lived obediently with them. He grew in body and spirit. So although Jesus was a mature 12-year-old in the temple, he was not yet a man and still needed to be protected and parented. In order that he could grow in such a way so he would be able to handle what would happen to him in his public ministry. But even at 12, Jesus really knew his place, didn't he? He knew his place was in his Father's house. He felt the call on his life that a relationship with God, his Father, was the most important thing. And even when he grew up and he started to do his public ministry, he still needed to check in with Dad, didn't he? We read about how he went away at different times and prayed to connect with his Father, to hear from God, to know that he was doing the right thing, that he was walking the right path. He never outgrew his need for parental support and guidance. And he knew that in order to honor God, his relationship with his Father had to be the most important thing in his life. And that's really our deal too, isn't it? We never really outgrow the need for parental support and guidance. And we always have that in God. And so we know that if Jesus, the Son of God, who was God, needed guidance, we need that as well. No matter our age, we still need that. And the way we can do that is by making sure that our relationship with God is the most important thing in our life. By focusing on drawing closer to Jesus and making him our number one priority. So in this time of reflection, I want you to think about how you prioritize your relationship with God, how you can draw closer to Jesus in this new year, how you can leave your assumptions behind, how you can grow up in God and find guidance at all times through Jesus.